Thank you, everyone, for joining in for the third session of the Metro Budget 101 series. I am Quante Toombs, District 2 Councilwoman and Chair of the Council's Budget and Finance Committee. I am joined by Councilwoman Delisha Porterfield, who represents District 29, and she is the Vice Chair of the Budget and Finance Committee. We have an excellent panel tonight. We're going to be talking about how the state impacts city revenues. We have Mr. Kevin Crumbo, who is the Finance Director for Davidson County. We also have Mr. Justin Wilson, who is the State Comptroller, and we have State Representative Harold Love. And so we will jump right into it. Councilwoman Porterfield and I are going to take turns moderating the questions. So we're going to start with Councilwoman Porterfield. Can you lead us off?
Yes, ma'am. Thank you so very much, Madam Chair. And the first question is for Finance Director Crumbo. If you could just explain to the viewing audience, what is the role of the Finance Director, and is your office a part of the Mayor's office?
Yeah, I'd be glad to do that. And thanks to both of you for hosting these sessions. I think the Metro budget is rather a complex beast. And I think taking time to dissect it here for those that are truly interested in going to be dealing with is an important thing. So thank you for doing it. It'll probably make my job a little easier when we get into the budget season, in the spring. My role is really the Chief Financial Officer for the city. It is not part of the mayor's office. It's designed that way by charter, but of course, my office and the law office and the mayor and a few others, we are one administration and we work very cohesively together. Some folks are surprised to find out that it's not actually part of the mayor's office. And that, again, has its roots in our charter going back to the 1960s, where we had a much smaller city, a much smaller government. Essentially, you had the executive officer of the city, the mayor, and the council, of course. And then what's now the big finance office and its many functions is really just a business office like you find in a lot of organizations at that time. So my role at this moment is to watch over a whole host of functions that range from treasury to purchasing, public properties, financial accountability, budgeting that I mentioned. And so it's sprung out to be a rather sizable office at this point in our history. And I won't be surprised at some point if we don't break that down a little bit and get a little more separation of the duties. But for right now, we're very focused on the structure of the way it is and trying to work our way through the COVID pandemic period.
Thank you so very much, Mr. Crumbo. I'm going to ask one more question and then I'll kick it over to Councilmember Toombs. So this has been a big conversation piece during the time that we're seeing with COVID. So can you explain your thought process when you make your determination of our city's projected revenues?
Yes. So on a annual basis, we really have three big buckets of revenue that are available to us. And the largest of those is our property taxes. And that's the most stable form of revenues really that we have. And I think most cities around the nation have. Next to that is our activities taxes, which most people really know as sales taxes, liquor taxes, and so forth. And then a little smaller buckets, fees that we charge for permits and so forth. And there's a lot of subparts to each one of those. Those are our big categories, though. Property taxes year over year are quite predictable in terms of what the total value of properties are across the county and what the rate to be charged on those is. Activities taxes, though, have quite a bit more volatility to them because they depend in large part on, of course, the activity themselves. So how much we buy and sell as consumers and vendors and whatnot. And Nashville's volatility there is probably quite a lot higher than many other cities, primarily because baked into that is our tourism. So as we're seeing now in this COVID era, we've had a pretty big drop off there, and it just adds to our volatility during this period. fees for permits and so forth are a little more city, a little more like property taxes. But year over year, we know what's steady, and we're learning a lot more how volatile things can be in this period. And so our thinking really involves in trying to predict that each and every year, and this year being one of the more difficult ones to do that.
Comptroller Wilson, can you explain what the role of the state comptroller is? I don't think a lot of people knew we had a state comptroller until the recent news about Nashville's finances during this past budget season. So can you explain what that role is?
Well, the primary role of the comptroller's office, I call myself the money cop. And the reason for that is that we want to make sure that all Tennesseans, the money that the government takes away from you in the form of taxes, is spent the way that, according to the law and according to the governing bodies. For example, the council decides. Make sure that the money goes where it's supposed to go. That is our primary role. We deal with the financial integrity of the state. That is our primary function, and that's exactly what we're all about.
So in that role, what oversight does your office have? What authority does your office have over city finances?
Oh, we have a lot of authority. Let's just talk about how we can really relate to the cities. First of all, for all the cities and counties, we're the auditors. In the case of metro government, it's contracted out, and the auditors were a private firm, do that under procedures that we agree upon, and they audited, but it's really our audit. The next thing we do is that we approve the budget. We review and approve the budget, make sure that it's balanced. That's the primary function, and to make sure that the basic obligations, such as paying the amount you're required to for education or for transportation, is done. The third role we have is there's some other minor roles, but they're the primary two roles.
Thank you so much. I'm sorry I couldn't get off of mute quickly enough. Just to piggyback off of that question, Comptroller, has your office ever taken over a city's finances?
Yes, we have. We've done that at least 3 times, but there's much smaller cities in Nashville. Come awful close with some large cities, but we've only done it really with some fairly small cities.
And so when you take over a city's finances, what does that look like for that city?
Well, that's something nobody wants to know about or find out about. The best is for it to not going to happen, and I firmly believe that we're going to do all we can to keep that from happening. What it basically means is that quite simply, is that the checkbook is run out of the state capitol, and all the expenditures are approved by the comptroller's office, and that is not a place that anybody wants to be.
Thank you so much for I'm sorry, Councilwoman Toombs, did I cut you off? Okay.
No, you didn't.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much for expounding on that, Comptroller. I have a question for Representative Love. Since we're talking about the state and the state's finances, can you talk to us a little bit about state preemption? We understand that city and county governments only have the powers that are given to them by the state. And many residents suggest potential revenue sources that Nashville does not have the legal authority to implement, such as taxing individuals who work in the county but live outside of the county. So there sometimes it seems to be a contentious relationship between Nashville and the state legislation. So can you explain to us about preemption and anything that you can suggest to us to help Nashville to avoid state preemption? And you are still muted, Representative Love.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, sir. Thank you.
All right, very good. Thank you. So when we talk about state preemption, we talk about the fact that sometimes you will have legislation that comes up to the General Assembly that seems to override what a local governing body has decided to enact. Without the state government involving itself, many times you would have local governments passing measures that would affect not just their area, but also when visitors come into their particular county. And so I know that there are oftentimes concerns about state preemption. I have concerns about them also because I know that each elected official from their own district is elected to represent their constituencies. But we have to understand also that many times what may happen in a particular county does have statewide implications. So I would suggest that oftentimes what may be the best thing to do is to have the local governing authority and those who represent them to have a conversation with elected officials at the state level before they look at passing measures for their particular area. And understand it's supposed to be a cooperative process, and there is an organization that really tries to work this out. It's called TASSER, and it's made up of county and city officials and also state legislators. And as a matter of fact, we met today and we discussed issues around broadband access. We discussed issues around local sales tax. And so it's within that group that we're trying to meet out all these conversations so that we don't have too much state preemption. But I do understand the frustration that comes because when you look at Nashville, contributing to 1/3 of the state's sales tax, you want to think that maybe there should be some more consideration given when a city like Nashville may have voters who express a view for a certain policy to be passed in their city and allow them to govern themselves in that manner. And then the state comes in and preempts those activities. So I do have concerns about that. And I would certainly just encourage our local council persons to reach out and have conversations with state level officials before maybe some ordinances are proposed or some laws are looking to be passed.
Thank you, Representative Love. That was very helpful. I know I found it helpful. I'm sure my colleagues may have found that helpful as well. I do have a follow-up question about impact fees. Can you explain for the viewing audience what impact fees are and why some cities in Tennessee are allowed to charge them and others are not? I know Nashville did have a bill that there was some legislation looking at allowing Nashville to implement some development impact fees. And, if you could just touch a little bit about where we are with that legislation.
Sure. Thank you for the question. Development taxes and impact fees are measures used by local governances to kind of mitigate the cost of growth. And the organization I mentioned a few minutes ago, TASSER, actually had a publication, and people can still go on the website and look at the TASSER publication entitled, Paying for Growth. And it talked about the fact that, every city and county wants to attract business. They want to attract industries and other entities to help grow that city, because by doing that, you expand your tax base. By doing that also, you help provide amenities for your constituents. And so when you see a city like Nashville that has had a tremendous growth occur in the last 15 years, people may wonder, what happened to other sources of revenue when you see all the construction that's going on, when you see the fact that roads are being torn up, and it seems as if there is no one who is covering the cost of that except for city government. It can become frustrating. So I know that there are several other counties that have impact fees, and went back and forth with a couple of people in Metro Council a few years back, just trying to figure out, was it a situation where Metro could not enact impact fees, or was it a situation where Metro could enact impact fees? And so we had a piece of legislation brought by Representative Darren Jernigan last year, which I think kind of would have put to bed finally this issue in question of whether Nashville could enact impact fees or not. And unfortunately, the legislation did not get out of committee. And so we have talked to members of that committee about the possibility of considering the fact that Nashville may need to have that tool at the disposal. Now, the beauty of the legislation and the original piece of legislation that was discussed in the TASA publication is that it does not say that you have to enact the impact fees or development taxes. It simply says that you will have at your disposal this extra tool to be able to choose if you should or not. And that's really, when you look at what we pass at the state level, much of what we do is pass legislation that enables a city to do something. You think about the gas tax we had a few years ago under Governor Haslam, which increased the amount of gas tax to help pay for our highways. There was a provision in there that allowed local governments to be able to increase certain taxes if they should develop a transportation plan. And again, it didn't say you had to increase it. It said that you are available and able to increase them. And so I know it can be frustrating sometimes because you have an idea, you think it's going to go forth and it doesn't. But I would just encourage, again, Nashville residents to talk to not just your Davidson County delegation, but also look at the members of that committee that voted against it, write a letter, send an email, make a phone call, and encourage them to support it if that's what you believe that you want to have. And I think it's, again, just another tool to have available should the Metro Council want to be able to use impact fees to divert the cost of development. Now, what's also important about development tax and impact fees is most of the time counties use them and cities use them also to help support education in that particular county or city. So it's not just like the impact fees just go into the general fund. They oftentimes are used, again, to offset the cost of education in that area.
Thank you so very much, Representative Love. I'm getting ready to kick it back over to Councilmember Toombs, but you just sparked something. So I want to ask this question before we move on. Two things. You said that we should, reach out to the other members of the committee. One, do you think that it would be helpful if, I know sometimes as a council we will do a letter and members of the council will sign on to it, and sometimes there's debate on whether or not those tools are effective. Some people think that it's, a waste of time. Other people think that it is effective. So do you think that that would be effective for us as a body to send a letter asking the other committee members to consider allowing us to have the legislation that we're looking at, such as impact fees?
It's very effective. And I'll use a situation from a bill I carried a few years back when I was concerned about Metro General closing. And I was concerned about not just the impact upon the healthcare of Nashvillians and, of course, people across the state, but also was concerned about the fact that Metro General, Erlanger, and Region 1 are unique entities in that they are able to generate these kind of expenses that can be reimbursed by the federal government. And so these are expenses as defined in the Medicaid legislation that says these are reimbursable expense because it is essentially a government-run hospital, and they're called certified medical expenditures, CMEs. So my concern was that you had Metro General possibly closing, and it wouldn't be like Vanderbilt or St. Thomas or Baptist could just up and start treating patients who weren't insured and also have certified medical expenditures. It was only a city-run hospital. So I brought legislation stating that Metro General could not be closed by the city of Nashville. And when I brought the bill to the committee, there was concern about whether it was supported by the city. And so when we talk about getting letters of support, this is where the letter of support can be very helpful, because then you can say, yes, the city does support this legislation. And it helps out because you don't want your state representative carrying a piece of legislation that the other legislative body that they are in the same city with does not support, or the people.
Thank you so very much. That was very helpful. I'm going to turn it over to Councilmember Toombs for the next question.
Director Crumbo. So Representative Love touched on two important topics that I want to talk to you about. One, he talked about Nashville generating a third of the state's sales tax revenue. And then he also talked about a lot of the development that folks are seeing, and most of that development is going on downtown. So I want to ask you about those two things. One, in terms of the sales tax revenue, we're hearing reports that, Nashville is actually doing a little bit better in its sales tax receipts. Can you talk about like the actual sales tax receipts for fiscal year 21?
Yeah, sure. And I think to talk about 21, we have to first start with the last quarter of 20, meaning really when the pandemic began. And I would imagine a lot of our viewers here know that we have a fiscal year end that ends in June. And so from a budget and projection standpoint, that gets to be real important to this. So, when the pandemic first began there in the springtime, I think most economists that you'd see in the media, and certainly the ones we rely on, and I believe the state in large part as well, were predicting this so-called V-shaped economy over the course of a year, maybe a little bit longer. And there were a few other names put on this, the Nike swoosh and what have you, but by and large thinking that the pandemic was going to be very severe and cause a big drop in economic activity for a few months, and then there would be a slow recovery from that, either through natural course or the development of a vaccine. And so we did see a general shape of that where the economy did start to come down, sales taxes and so forth that correspond to consumer activity. But the drop in that first few months wasn't quite as severe as was being predicted overall. And quite interesting for us here locally, we saw quite a lot of what is known as a substitution effect, meaning you mentioned the downtown area. So those of us who work downtown that would be down there all day and pay for our lunch and some tax there and so forth, if we weren't spending it there, then it seems that we were spending it somewhere else in the county, at a Kroger or what have you, and essentially substituting one for the other. So that substitution effect was large and much more traceable in this period of time than it would have been a few years ago, primarily because technology allows us to trace transactions better, and we have rules and laws now that allow us to trace and tax, straight to where activity happens. And so our fall off wasn't nearly as large in that first period that we were anticipating. And in fact, by the numbers at that time, we were thinking we would see a loss relative to our budget of roughly $200 million or so. And we wound up seeing a loss of about half that, which is fabulous news for all the obvious reasons. On the other side of it, we haven't seen the climb out of the economy be quite so steep either. And I think most everyone tuned in here would look at any type of report and see where this pandemic is lingering, could impact us for a lot longer than was initially expected. And I heard some estimates yesterday from some of the big rating agencies that they're really not expecting a sizable recovery until the calendar year 22 or even 23. And so from a predictive standpoint here, we're starting to adjust our thinking about that. So far, our sales taxes year to date, or I should say our activities taxes, are still about $35 million more than we were anticipating at this point in the year. So we're halfway through the year. Because of the way we predicted, we're not anticipating at this time that it's going to get a lot bigger. And in fact, if the economy takes a nosedive, it could just vanish altogether. So we join the rest of the world in a lot of uncertainty at this point, even through this year and quite frankly on into next. And I get a lot of pressure from a lot of folks saying, can't we get closer? Can't we get closer? And boy, if I could do that, I would be doing it better than any other financial officer I know. And my brain power just isn't that good. Be curious to hear from Comptroller Wilson. He's obviously watching a lot of the same things. I think serves on a revenue committee at the state. What his perspective on this topic is.
Comptroller Wilson, you want to jump in?
Well, I sure will. We don't know what the economy is going to do. We don't know what revenues are going to produce. The state revenues are higher than what we anticipated for the year, and we feel good about that. But the uncertainty is even greater than what we expected. The main thing we need to do is be prepared for gosh knows what's going to happen, because nobody really knows. It's a whole lot better to not to spend money and spend it later when you know you got it than to spend money you don't have and then figure out some way to get it back. So yes, it's looking good. I mean, the numbers are better than we anticipated, but we really don't know what the future is going to bring. We just don't know.
And Director Crumbo, you talked about pressure. I know during this past couple of months, there was some pressure on you to change your revenue projections because of the news that we were doing better in sales tax receipts than anticipated. Explain your thought process and pretty much sticking to what your original projections were.
Yeah, and so again, crossing these fiscal years is really important. So with the higher than expected revenues from the prior quarter coming into this fiscal year, from a cash basis and fund balance basis, we were able to go from essentially having very few reserves at all, again, meaning cash and fund balances, to having our designated minimum balances or something close to it, which was very pleasing for all the reasons that Comptroller Wilson just outlined. And I would imagine specifically Nashville, very pleasing to his office, because we were thinking we wouldn't reach that level until the end still of this fiscal year. So it gave us some cushion that we were not expecting, which is a very good thing. At the time that I was seeing the most pressure to change the estimate, that was really in hope that by doing that there would be some opportunity to lower the property tax rate increase that we had enacted for this year. But again, for all the reasons the comptroller was just outlining, there was just so much uncertainty at that time that I didn't see, cause to change the estimate. But rather, let's stick with what we have. Let's have some reserve to take care of ourselves for the longer term. And I think the proponents of that would see that as a very good, prudent, responsible thing to do. Critics, of course, would say we have a community that's hurting. This tax increase, any expenses all, and households and businesses already suffering. Any relief we could provide would certainly be welcome, and that's right. They're correct about that. But it's my job in this role to balance the need to have some cushion as a city and to be able to provide our services for the long term with some stability versus that relief. And so what we've tried to do is seek that relief other places. And we've certainly had CARES monies that have come to us, state grants. We're hoping that there will be some additional stimulus dollars there if this is going to be very prolonged. And again, for those that watch the media, they can see where that debate is happening right now at federal and state levels. So I'm going to continue to manage us to that minimum balance level, adjust where we can, provide relief where we can, but try and find that balance as best we can.
Let me add that it is very, very dangerous to change your estimates based on 1 or 2, even 3 months experience. We just don't know, and it's extraordinarily dangerous to change estimates when you don't really have a full picture.
Thank you for that, Comptroller Wilson. I do want to go a little bit further, Director Crumbo, because you talked about, not knowing what's going to happen in the future. And really, it sounds like Nashville, that you're in line with what the state's projections are, the conservative approach, and, just wanting to be careful and reserve cash. As Comptroller Wilson said, it's better to hold on to your money and have it to spend later than to spend it now and then you don't have the cash that you need to pay your bills. I think one thing that's on residents' minds when we're talking about not knowing, they're seeing that sales tax revenues are doing a little bit better. Like you said, we did have a large property tax increase, but it seems like development has not slowed down in Nashville. You still see a lot of development going on downtown. There's a lot of, I still get comments that, we're giving too many incentives to corporations, and that's why we don't have any money. So can you talk a little bit about that? Like, how much are we giving out in incentives to corporations? What's the largest incentive that we give? We hear about these big deals, like recently we had the bond offering for MLS. So that was the stadium deal, soccer stadium deal was had a big dollar amount attached to it. Can you just break that down for us as far as the obligation from the city standpoint, and if there's any state financial obligation in deals like that?
Yeah, so you've got quite a lot there, and you asked me to break it down. So I'm going to do my best to take some pieces there. First, let me start with what you did, and that's the incentives. So I think in years gone by, there have been probably, at least half a dozen types of incentives that the city has offered to attract new businesses to town or work with ones we have to develop more. And, just roughly speaking, I think we tend to look at the media and see where there have been grants to corporations to come to town and bring us jobs. And there's been a loose formula there of a few $100s per certain type of job that can be created and hang around Nashville for a while. And there's a list of companies that have taken advantage of that. I remember back during the budget process, we talked quite a bit about some big success stories with HCA and Asurion and others, and some that were less performing in that. But those are not the only types of incentives that we've offered over time for companies to come to the city. We have tried to make TIF financing or tax increment financing to spur growth, either for folks coming or to circle around certain areas of town, tourist development zones. And there's a lot of initials and alphabet soup that goes with all that. But by and large, the idea is to make it a little cheaper for those companies to get started with those ventures, hoping that if they're successful, that they will pay more tax in the long term and be big contributors to our economy and to our tax base. During this, mayoral administration, and really the time I started serving, there's been very little activity for new incentives. I think Mayor Cooper had become opposed to doing a lot more of that, or at least at the pace that we've done in the past, because to your point, we have already had a lot of activity and trying to absorb what we have. But then quite frankly, a few months into the administration, we have some tornadoes and a pandemic, and our focus really shifts to all the things we've been talking about already on this call. So I think while that's happening, the mayor's office is gearing up to hire a new economic development director and lay out a new strategy for what incentives, if any, there will be down the line. So that's really a to be determined, and really to be more determined by the mayor's office than mine. And so I'll track along with them and support that analytically. But I think to be determined when we have a new economic development director. You started touching on some of the other things that are happening in town. You mentioned soccer. I am just thrilled to say that we did close this morning about 9 a.m. Central Time on the bonds for the soccer stadium. There's a lot of myth out there about what that really looks like. And just to break that down, it's the Sports Authority, which is a component unit of the Metro government that issued those bonds. They are not payable from the general obligations of the Metro government, but rather those bonds are to be paid through a lease of that stadium from the team and some ticket tax revenues and things that go along with that. There's a guarantee, from one of the team owners if that were to fall short. And then, if it really got terrible, then the Metro government would have some obligations to step in later. But those bonds were issued for less than a 3% interest cost. And this is some great news for all of us. Despite the pandemic, investor confidence is high enough in that project and the city overall that those bonds were 6 times oversubscribed. Which is, for every bond we had $6 trying to buy it. Beyond that, we had one of the rating agencies went so far as to say they like where the general government's headed, and they've lifted their negative outlook for us even in the middle of the pandemic and moved us to the stable category. And that's come with an ump of keep doing what you're doing, not only from the rating agency, but comptroller sent me a nice note and said, keep doing that. And I've taken that as my charge to march forward, not only with soccer and get that finished, but in the, by February or so, we are going to try and refinance part of our existing bond portfolio on a similar type of terms, meaning, that same low interest rate. And right now, my projections are that may save us close to $40 million in interest if we're able to do that. So I could talk on and on about changes to the bond portfolio and the debt and so forth, but I hope all of you would take comfort that, at least in the eyes of rating agencies and investors, that we as your Metro government are trying to do the right things and recover from this pandemic, and even plan further as to what the post-pandemic world's going to look like, because that's certainly when we'll be starting to see soccer fans arrive and play soccer, and capital spending happen for sidewalks and things that I know are near and dear to all of us that live here in Nashville.
Thank you so very much, Director Crumbo. I will be coming back to you in just one moment because I do have a follow-up question for you, but I would like to call on our former budget chair, Councilman Mendez. I know he's done a lot of work around TIFs as well. And Councilman Mendez, I just wanted to give you an opportunity to touch on this. I know you did explain this and you provided some really good insight at our previous session. But I do know that some people are watching today that weren't watching the previous session. So if you would like to just give a little follow-up, we would appreciate it.
Sure, and I'll keep it brief. The question was, how much do we spend on incentives? And there ends up being a lot of misinformation. Like, one of the things, Council Lady, that we see in our inbox all the time is, hey, why y'all spending so much money on Amazon? And the reality is, as of today, Nashville has never paid one penny to Amazon for any incentive ever. We have a deal with them where one day we'll pay $500 a job for 7 years up to a certain dollar amount. That's probably a couple years in the future. And listen, I always say that if people are misinformed or don't have the right information, that's on Metro. Historically, for doing a bad job. Hell, it's what I've run on both times, is the lack of transparency on these sort of economic incentives. To answer the question, though, the cost, this year, the number is going to be in the low $20 million worth of property taxes that got sidetracked to do tax increment financing loans. And if you add up every last economic incentive that you could dream up in the 6 or 7 categories that Mr. Crumbo referred to, I don't think that the number would double. So I think I've never brought it down to an exact spreadsheet, but I think the amount that we would spend on an economic incentives to everybody in a year to businesses might be $35, $40 million. And when you think about a $2.5 billion budget, it really is a relatively small number. The problem is Metro has historically hid the ball, not been transparent. Nobody has ever done a study to show what the economic benefit is from those incentives. And my argument that you've heard me make over the last several years is, if Metro did a better job of being transparent about the cost and the benefit of what we get for it, in the long run, people would feel better about incentives. But here we are. It is real that it's a number into the couple, 2, 3, 4 tens of millions. It is real money. And because it's hard to figure out and it's hard to get a spreadsheet that lays it all out, people don't trust it. I would make the argument that it's worth it in the long run for the reasons that Mr. Crumbo explained. But the Metro government owes people more transparency in order to make them feel better about that and to prove it to them. With that, I'll be quiet. Thank you.
Thank you so very much, Councilman Mendez. I do want to go back to our finance director. You mentioned the rainy day fund, and I know sometimes people are a little bit confused about that fund. So we've received questions about what is the purpose? Is it just a savings account? Do we pay bills out of that fund? So if you could just briefly explain to the audience what is the purpose of the rainy day fund?
Yeah, I'd be glad to do that. Thanks for that question. So when we hear that term rainy day, it means a few different things in different environments. But, by and large, I think the way that most people think of it is, the money that you do have set back someplace, somewhere that you can use for a rainy day. So when really, bad things are going to happen. And some view that as just being your general fund balance, perhaps the minimum balance, in our case, 5% of annual expenditures and so forth. Others would say, it is a special savings account, the way you described, where you take money very specifically and deposit in a very specific place so that that's the first money that you would go to when something happens, as opposed to your general fund. Council Lady, can you hear me okay? I see you struggling.
Yes.
Yeah, okay. And so we, in this last budget cycle, really did not have any sizable fund balance. In fact, seeing Councilman Mendez, I remember when we were building up some fund balance, he phoned me at one point and he said, just to be straight, this is all good news, we're building it, but we've gone from having like a few hours of cash to having a few days of cash. And at the time he said that, it was humorous, but he was right. And we talked at that time about rainy day and building up our fund balances, as well as setting aside a very special account for it. And we wound up doing both of those things. Budget-wise, it wasn't possible to put, big money into a very specific rainy day fund that we call that. But I'm hopeful in the future that we will make progress there. But in light of where we are with the pandemic and so forth, I'm much more focused on just operating the government day to day, keeping our minimum fund balances and manage as closely as we can during all this uncertainty.
Thank you so very much, Mr. Crumbo. I do have a question for our comptroller. And you touched on it a little bit, but I want to go just a little bit deeper. You said it's dangerous to change estimates based on a few months projections, and I think that many of us agree with that sentiment. Since Nashville's already approved its budget for this year, do you have any thoughts on Nashville's approach to balancing its budget? So do you have any thoughts on the council regulating the tax rate, bringing it back to the rate where it had been previously? And also, do you have any thoughts on Nashville's fund balance in comparison to the fund balance of other counties in Tennessee, how we compare to other areas?
Well, there are a whole lot of questions there, and I'll answer some of them. Our goal is to have a 20% fund balance, and this is what the experts all say is the right amount. That's far less than far more than what Nashville has, and Nashville can't realistically get there in the next year or two. The level of taxation and how you spend your money is inherently a local decision. That's a decision for the council to make. To what level you want to tax your citizens and what services you want to provide. Our concern is that you take care of the basics, that you pay your debts on time, that you provide for the education at the level that you're required to, what we call the maintenance of effort. That you meet your obligations. And really, to what level you want to tax the citizens of Davidson County really is a decision for the Metro Council. I can't tell you what the right tax rate is or what you ought to spend your money on. That's really your decision because, I can, but you don't want me to. So I really think that's something that you should focus on and make the decision. It's tough decisions whether or not you want to tax people or where you provide services and what services you provide. It's not an easy decision, and that's why you were elected to make these tough decisions.
Well, thank you so much for that. And I do have a question for Representative Love. One thing that comes up often when we're having the conversation around the budget is the state income tax. and why Tennessee doesn't have a state income tax, and how does the lack of that income tax have a negative impact on cities? So could you speak on that for us?
I can, and I will refer to Comptroller Wilson to correct me if I'm wrong about the timeline. But one of the reasons we don't have a state income tax is because a few years ago, when the legislature considered it, you had folks all up and down Charlotte Avenue, which is now Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Boulevard, expressing their displeasure with the possibility of a state income tax. And that was a situation where the legislature realized that that was not what the people wanted to have come into their life. It speaks to the basic understanding of a representative democracy, and that the citizens engage in a contract with their government that they will agree to be governed, and that the stewards of the government at that time, agree to enact policy to improve the quality of life of the citizens. And so Tennessee has done a good job being able to manage its finances and being able to fund programs without the need for a state income tax. I think that really speaks more to the management of the state budget and the provisions that were given at the time, and realized that we could fund our initiatives off of what we had coming in from sales tax and from business and excise tax and other taxes to be able to, and federal grants, right, and to be able to run state government effectively.
Thank you so very much, Representative Love.
If I could I just very briefly touch on the issue of incentives also, because I know there was a question about that. One thing that's unique to Nashville that you may find in other parts of the state is because Nashville is a metropolitan form of government, it doesn't have to compete with the county portion of the government for attracting businesses to that particular area. Oftentimes what you'll find in other parts of the state is you'll have a county government and then there's a city government. And there may be some contention because the county government may offer a business an incentive to come to the part of the county, but that business will locate there, and those incentives may be more than what the city portion of that government was going to offer. And it gets into the issue also of who's paying for the schools, because oftentimes your schools are located in the county portion of that location, and the city gets more of the sales tax revenue. So Nashville is blessed in that when the metropolitan form of government offers an incentive to a business to locate here, it doesn't have to compete with Nashville versus Davidson County, like Memphis might have to compete with Shelby County, or Knoxville with Knox County, or Chattanooga with Hamilton County.
Thank you for bringing that up, Representative Love. And that was just a perfect segue into the next question. I know a big part of Nashville's budget goes to funding education. And as a former teacher, education was one of my big priorities. And we hear a lot of teachers and education advocates asking us to fully fund public schools. There's a lot of conversation around the BEP formula, but many people don't understand the BEP formula. So can you explain the BEP formula and explain why some cities in Tennessee get more funding than we do? Now, I know you could probably take 3 hours to explain it, but if you could just explain it in a concise manner, since we're getting close to 7 o'clock, we'd appreciate it.
Then I'm going to read from the on the BEP formula. The BEP formula has 4 major categories: instruction, benefits, classroom, and non-classroom. And the BEP formula is a basic education formula that says that we're going to fund our schools at this level. And sometimes that can be hard for folks to take because they say, well, the basic is not what we need. We need more. Comptroller Wilson referred to this thing called maintaining effort a few moments ago, which is where the state requires the funding body of a government rather, to, at the minimum, provide to the school board what they funded last year. And this is to make sure that there are no situations where the local government does not give what's needed. So the BEP funding formula is a combination of federal dollars coming down with state dollars and then requiring a local match. So the issue then becomes this phrase called fiscal capacity. So the state says, listen, if an area has fiscal capacity more than another area, then that area can probably pay more of their local share toward the education of their child. So Nashville is a growing city. We have 2 professional, now 3 professional athletic teams. We have a semi-pro baseball team, right? And so we have all these other industries coming in. We have Amazon coming in. We have the Country Music Hall of Fame. We have a booming tourism industry. So now what the state will say is, with all of that availability you have to raise property taxes, you have a higher fiscal capacity than Grundy County or Washington County or even a Hamilton County, where Chattanooga is, or maybe even a Knox County. So since you have a higher fiscal capacity, we are going to say that your local portion of the BEP funding formula should encompass more than it did last year. And so what you may see is a situation where the state portion of the BEP contribution shrinks in order to say to Nashville, you can make up the difference. Now, of course, to Nashville, that does not feel comfortable, because you say, well, listen, you can't count my dollars, right? You can't count my money, because now I got to go and raise property taxes just to fund education. And this is where language also becomes important, because technically, when the school board presents a budget to the Metro Council can either fund it at the level at which the school board requested, or fund it at a lower level, as long as it meets the threshold of maintaining effort. Metro Council cannot cherry pick. They cannot line item, take things out. All they can do is vote it up or down. And that becomes frustrating for Metro Council members, because you also ran on this ticket of improving education, and you also are concerned about Metro schools. So now the more frustrating part comes when Metro School says, well, you didn't fully fund our budget. Well, technically we did. That's what Metro Council and the mayor will say, because we maintained effort. And so we fully funded your budget. We did what was required by the state. But then Metro Schools may say, yeah, but it's going to cost more. And that's where the frustration comes in, because people say, well, we want to have more things funded in the BEP funding formula. I would suggest also, while you're writing letters to my colleagues and myself about BEP, that you might want to also suggest to us including school counselors in the BEP funding formula, because if there's not a category for things like school counselors, it's hard to justify putting money fully into that for school counselors. So that's the BEP funding formula in a short synopsis. I would encourage people to go to the State Department of Education's website and read up on the BEP funding formula. I'd also encourage you to go to TACIR's website, TACIR, and also read the studies we've done on the BEP funding formula, because it's not just a national issue. Now it is a rural issue also, because what you have going on now, Comptroller spoke about a fund balance. In some counties, what you have is the requirement for the school district to have a fund balance. The fund balance is being kept in an account, and the interest is being used by the local government to pay for other bills because they're so cash strapped.
Thank you so much, Representative Love. That was very, very insightful. Thank you for sharing.
Thank you.
And before we open it up for questions from fellow council members, I did want to follow up on a point from Comptroller Wilson about the size of the rainy day fund for a city like Nashville. Director Crumbo, Comptroller Wilson said that the rainy day fund should be 20% fund balance. I hope I'm saying that correctly.
So that's what the associations on local government say is an accurate amount. We don't have a magical number.
Okay. But if Nashville were to do 20%, what does that look like, Director Crumbo?
So we'd be talking about 20% of our annual expenditures of roughly $2.5 billion, if you're going to include schools in that. So that's a big number. I'm sure everybody can do that math in their head here. And I think the comptroller was right that to reach that level in the next few years would be extremely difficult. We took some big steps in that direction with the last budget and the tax increase, controversial or not, that accompanied that. And, to continue to grow and reach those levels, either revenues need to come up or expenses need to come down, or some combination of those. It's going to make sense to grow those. Nashville, because of the way that it's structured, its fund balances are way below 20%. We're in the 5%-ish, category at this moment. We do, though, have the sizable benefit of borrowings amongst our own metro entities, which we call the tax anticipation notes, which go between water. That's the largest one, and a few others. It allows us as a whole metro government to use more cash that's in our system, and so that's really our best alternative right now to having actual cash, in fund balance or in a specified rainy day fund. But it does give us some liquidity that isn't often thought about in discussion here. As a financial officer, I will be, egging on during this next budget process a little bit more fund balance and make a commitment to growing to much larger levels in the future. But my goodness, in the middle of this pandemic, I just don't think it's realistic that we can take, a bigger, much bigger bite out of that than we have already.
So, Comptroller Wilson.
Let me just say that what Metro government did this year by actually addressing the issue of fund balance is an enormous positive step. And I don't think anyone expects Metro to get to the level that you would like to see in 1 or 2 years. I think that's totally unrealistic. But in fact, that you're moving in the right direction and you recognize that you have a problem and you're dealing with it is an enormous positive step.
So I do have my calculator here, and if it's correct, we're talking about roughly about $400 million or so dollars that we would need to meet that 20% threshold. It'd actually be more than $400 million. What's our current fund balance, Director Crumbo?
Yeah, so as of today, we're roughly $100 million or so fund balance in cash. And I want to be cautious when I start to use those terms. Cash and fund balance are actually different things, and there's a lot of timing and accounting accruals that go into that. But, to say right now that it's roughly $100 million and roughly a quarter of, the 400 or so that you just mentioned, that would, I think, give everyone here the sense of the magnitude of how much growth would be needed. We could get a, finer pencil on that at some point, but roughly that's how much we're talking about. And I think what leads the comptroller to say what he did, and it's unrealistic that you could get there in a very short period of time, but maintaining what we have for sure and trying to grow it is certainly what I would like to see.
Right. And when you're talking about, trying to grow it, that means we're either cutting or finding some money somewhere. And I think all of the council members hear from constituents that want us to find the money from somewhere, some source other than them. So my final question to you before opening it up to other council members, are we tapping into all of our revenue sources as a city? Are there some untapped resources from the state that we could be looking at?
Yeah, so I think the most realistic one for us is what's already been talked about here, and that's our impact fees. There's a world of possibility of things that we could do, whether it would be working through the state or other types of taxes that we can bring about on our own. But the impact fees, for all the reasons that were mentioned, are quite targeted to specific areas. So I think earlier here, when you were talking about all the development downtown, the folks that are most closely associated with that would probably benefit the most from an impact fee that said, hey, we're going to pay a little bit more for this type of development, and we're going to spend it here, on the folks that are most impacted by it. That's generally how that works. how exactly it would work here would be, depending on how we write up the rules. But first things first, I would think we do need to work with the state on getting us the opportunity to allow that to begin with, and then we can see if we could bring that around. Other than that, I think working, things are within our reach that could lead us to good things are, the pilot programs that we've heard about, some of the other incentives, perhaps to spur development in a particular area that would lead us to more taxes over the long term. Those are all in the universe of possibilities. In terms of probabilities right now, I think until we're clearly on the other side of the pandemic and know what normal looks like, it would be very difficult to start implementing those things, not knowing really what the outcome is most likely to be.
Thank you so very much, Mr. Crumbo. And we are at time, but we're going to open the floor up just for a few minutes to some of our colleagues. So if there are any council members that have any questions, if you could just raise your WebEx hand, and we will try to get to as many as we can in the few minutes that we're going to spend on this. And the first hand that I see is Councilmember Hauser. You are recognized.
Thank you. Yes, I have two questions that are directed really towards the state. When we were talking about the formulas for our schools, one of the things that we find in Nashville more than other areas of the state are the large number of English language as a second language learners, which requires a great deal of expenditure to support those students. But I have not seen anything in our formula, and it may just be my neglect, that gives extra money towards that. As I say, other parts of the state, especially the rural counties, may not have as many English learners as we do in Nashville. Is there any way that formula could be adjusted to take care of that? And then the second question towards the state is in reference to what Nashville is allowed to charge for our fees. As I look at some of the fees, they seem to be maybe enough money for someone handing someone a piece of paper and it being filed, but not really for the implementation of that permit or the following up when a code is violated. And it seems to me that those costs of the department should all be borne by how much we charge for those fees. And I'll mute again and let you answer those questions.
I guess that's directed towards me. I think the first thing to realize is that the BEP is a formula and is set forth and explained in great detail on our website, which is very complex, and almost every part of it is controversial. We have 132 school districts in Tennessee, and of those 132 do not believe they're getting their fair share. I can assure you that's the case. English is a second language, foreign students, that's a legitimate question. And each school district has their own areas. I suggest that this is exactly the sort of thing that the BEP is a living formula that needs to be changed by law. This is exactly the sort of thing that you can talk to the representatives to see if not there's any changes are appropriate or necessary or possible. I'm very sympathetic with the whole area of education, and it's 40% of state dollars goes to local education for the BEP. And how that money is split up is a major concern and needs to be transparent and open and verifiable. And we're certainly trying to do exactly that. The many fees are, go to the next question, many fees have limitations of what you can charge legally, but most of them don't. And that's a local decision of what you want to charge the citizens for making the services available. And It's always a tough decision about what the right amount is.
Thank you so very much.
I would also offer that the English as a second language student conversation about spending more money on them also speaks to a philosophical issue, because as a state, we have to consider that if we are to give more money for students who are learning English as a second language, we also need to consider making in-state tuition available for those students who may be having those same issues, because we've had bills to make English as a second learner. I mean, those students who are having these issues and may not be naturalized citizens yet, to have in-state tuition, but we failed to pass that legislation. So to me, it's a philosophical question that I think we can do it. We can put more money in the BEP for students who have English as a second language, but also we can pass legislation to give those students who are not naturalized citizens, who want to become citizens, the opportunity to have in-state tuition in the state where they have graduated from one of our high schools.
Thank you so much, Representative Love. I want to kind of follow up on that question with you. One thing that we heard a lot during budget season was, and I agree with Comptroller Wilson, I think everyone feels as though they're not getting their fair share of the pie. So one thing that we heard a lot during budget season was, instead of trying to get a larger slice of the pie, how do we make the pie larger so that in theory, all counties in Tennessee are getting more money for education? That's the first part of the question. And then the second part of that question, I just forgot the second part of that question. So if it comes back to me, I will ask you.
Well, let me say the best way to get more money is to increase economic activity and have people having more jobs, making more money, spending more money, and having just a good, healthy economy.
Thank you so much, Comptroller Wilson. Representative Love, is that something that the state legislation can look at as well, getting more money, more BEP money for counties?
Yeah, I'm always reminded that all you need is 51 votes in the House and 18 in the Senate, and you can do most anything. But no, I think that when we come back in session in January, definitely you will see school districts have been talking to their elected officials over this past few months about exactly how much is needed, because it has cost them more. So I would look for conversations again around that. And I can't emphasize enough the conversation that mayors and other county officials have been having with TASER about just what Comptroller Wilson said, which is everybody now is saying, listen, we need more money because the money coming down is not enough to educate our children with the social, emotional needs they have and other issues they're facing.
Thank you so much. And I'm looking through the queue, and it does not appear we have any other questions for the council members. So council members, this is your last call. And if someone from ITS can move, we do have a call from an attendee, Don Harrington. If someone from ITS can move her from attendee up to a panelist, and then unmute her, we will allow her to ask that question. Thank you so much. Don, you are recognized.
Yes, and thank y'all so much for putting on this. It is so important, and I'm excited to share the recordings when they're made available with everyone that I can, because I think this conversation is so important. And my question is around the BEP formula. Does that include resource officers? Are they included in the BEP formula, or how does that work?
I will direct that question to whoever wants to answer that, between Councilmember Toombs or Comptroller Wilson or Representative Love. We don't have anyone from MNPS on the call with us right now.
I don't think they're spelled out as a part of BEP, and I think Representative Ogles a few years ago, tried to bring a piece of legislation which would have funded SROs in every school. I think I'm correct about that.
You are correct about that. And let me make this clear about the BEP. The BEP does not tell you how to spend the money. It determines how much money you get. It's a funding formula. It's not a spending plan. And so a lot of items that you may want to have in the BEP are not there. And whether you spend money there or not is a local decision for the local education, for the school boards.
And I'll add that the SROs for Metro, that funding comes out of the MMPD budget. MMPS does not pay for SROs.
And keep in mind also, Dawn, that when you talk about BEP funding formula, it's a statewide piece. And so you may have areas like Nashville where Metro Police pays for the SROs. You may have another county where they don't have the budget in their police department or sheriff's department to pay for the SROs. And so the school district has to pay for it. So it just depends on what that particular county does, as Comptroller Wilson says, to spend that money that way.
And Ms. Harrington, your hand is still up. Did you have a follow-up question?
No, I appreciate you all's answers on the question. I just thank y'all for putting this on.
Okay, thank you so very much. And with that, we do not have any other hands. So with that, we just want to thank you all for joining us today. Thank you to our esteemed guests. Thank you for everyone who watched and tuned in. And I believe our next session, Councilwoman Toombs, is next year.
It is January 7th at 6 p.m. We'll be talking about Metro schools. We'll have school board member Frida Player-Peters, as well as the Chief Operating and Finance Officer, Chris Henson. So I'm sure that'll be a great discussion. And I'd like to thank everyone for participating this evening and staying on with us.
And with that, we wish you all a happy holidays and enjoy the rest of your time. Representative Love, you're recognized.
Thank you, and thank you for the opportunity to join tonight. I would be remiss if I did not acknowledge, while he is here, the fine work that Comptroller Wilson has done, as he has announced that he is going to be smiling a lot more now because he's retiring. So I want to thank him for his work with the state government.
Thank you for your service.
Thank you.
Good night, everyone.
Good night.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys.
Thank y'all.